Billionaire donates millions to charity, but what he gets in return will shock the world. He built an empire of success, but when he faced the truth about himself, what he got in return for his generosity will change everything. Don't miss what's coming next. Arthur Montgomery's hand hovered over the glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. He didn't drink for pleasure, only to unwind, to ease the tension after a long day of ruthless negotiations and high-profile meetings. He lifted the glass to his lips, letting the warmth fill his throat, then set it down again with a precise motion, as though even the act of drinking was calculated. The press conference had been a success. He had delivered his words perfectly, just as planned. The headlines would write themselves. Montgomery Charitable Foundation donates $50 million to fight hunger and poverty. The numbers would be dissected, praised, perhaps even scrutinized, but no one could deny the power of the gesture. Arthur took another look at his phone. The messages, the calls, the emails, they flooded in congratulating him for his generosity, his philanthropy. He had become an icon in the business world, not just for his empire, but for his willingness to make a difference. Or so it seemed. Arthur, a voice called from the doorway. His daughter, Laura, stood there, a hesitant smile on her face. "You still up?" "It's past midnight." "Didn't realize the time," Arthur replied, his voice flat. Laura stepped inside, folding her arms across her chest. "I saw the announcement. You're getting a lot of praise." Arthur didn't answer, picking up the whiskey glass again. "I don't get it, Dad," she continued. "You know what's going on in the world. The poverty, the suffering. All these people who need real help. Why does it always have to be about the numbers, the press releases? Why not just do something for them without all the spectacle?" Her words stung, but Arthur didn't show it. He'd heard this before in different forms. Laura didn't understand. She couldn't. She had the luxury of growing up in a world that catered to her every need, a world that never asked her to make tough choices, to live without. He set the glass down with a quiet clink and met her eyes. "I'm doing something, Laura. You're welcome to come with me and see it firsthand. The money will change lives, you'll see." Laura shook her head, her expression troubled. "I'm not talking about the money. I'm talking about people, real people, who need more than a check, who need someone to see them." Arthur's gaze drifted toward the dark city skyline outside his window. He had seen it all, the poverty, the injustice. But he had also seen the power that money could wield. Money solved problems. Money fixed things. Laura didn't get that. "Good night, Laura," Arthur said, his voice flat, dismissing the conversation. Laura hesitated, then turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. "I just want you to understand, Dad. Money isn't everything." Arthur didn't respond. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence returned to the room. He sat there for a long moment, the weight of his daughter's words lingering in the air. She was wrong, of course. He had done the right thing. He had given millions to causes that needed it. What else could he do? Arthur picked up his phone again, scrolling through the endless stream of messages. Then a particular headline caught his eye. "Montgomery donates millions, but does it matter?" The headline was harmless enough, but it made him pause. What if it didn't matter? What if all of this grand gesture, wasn't enough to fix what was broken in the world? Arthur shook his head. He didn't have time for such doubts. There was a meeting in the morning. He had responsibilities. The world would move on. But as he stood up to leave the room, a lingering thought gnawed at him. What if Laura was right? What if giving money wasn't the answer? The sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, a reminder of the isolation that had followed him throughout his life. He had everything, but still something was missing. The next morning, Arthur arrived at his office earlier than usual, the weight of the previous night's conversation still hanging over him like a storm cloud. His staff had already begun their day, hustling to meet deadlines, but the usual buzz of activity felt distant. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. Mr. Montgomery, his assistant Rachel, greeted him as she stepped into his office with her usual professional smile. "You're getting a lot of media coverage. The donation's already making waves." Arthur nodded, barely acknowledging her. He sat down at his desk and picked up a stack of reports, trying to immerse himself in the numbers. But his mind kept drifting back to Laura's words. The office phone rang, snapping him back to the present. "Mr. Montgomery, this is Michael from the press office," the voice on the other end said. "We've received a flood of inquiries about the donation. It's all over the news. You've got interviews lined up, and the social media is buzzing with praise. It's all looking great. People are calling you a hero." Arthur didn't respond right away. He could feel the weight of his decision bearing down on him. A hero? He wasn't a hero. He was a businessman who'd made a strategic move, leveraging his wealth to protect his public image. What did any of it mean if it didn't come with real change? "I don't want any more press right now," Arthur said, his voice a little sharper than he intended. "Cancel the interviews. Tell them I'm unavailable." "Understood, sir." As the line went dead, Arthur leaned back in his chair, staring out the large windows of his corner office. The city below looked the same as it always did. Busy, chaotic, filled with people rushing to their destinations. And yet, he couldn't help but wonder if, beneath the glossy surface, things were more broken than he cared to admit. Later that afternoon, Arthur was scheduled to meet with a group of representatives from the largest charitable organizations in the world. They were the ones who would distribute the funds he had promised, who would ensure that his money went to the causes that mattered most. Arthur's assistant briefed him on the details, but he couldn't focus. His mind kept returning to the faces of the people he'd seen on TV, in the media stories about poverty, hunger, and the homelessness crisis. By the time the meeting began, Arthur felt numb. "We've reviewed the proposal," Mr. Montgomery, one of the directors of the charity, said, handing him a report. "Your donation is unprecedented. It's going to make a real difference. The communities we serve are already expressing their gratitude." Arthur flipped through the pages, pretending to read the statistics. But nothing felt real. The words on the paper didn't match the emotion he felt, or rather, the lack of it. He nodded absently, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll begin the distribution immediately," the director continued, eyes shining with hope. "With your contribution, we'll have a fighting chance at tackling the issues that have been neglected for so long." Arthur forced another smile. He had to play the part. He had to keep up appearances. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the nagging thought. Was this all just a performance? A way for him to make himself feel better? To escape the reality of the world he had helped build? "Great," Arthur said, his voice steady but distant. "I trust you'll use the funds wisely." The meeting continued, but Arthur's mind had already wandered. He thought back to Laura's words. They echoed in his mind like a broken record. Money isn't everything, but what else could he give? His time? His attention? How could he possibly make a difference when he had been so detached from the very people he was trying to help? Just as the meeting ended, a new message popped up on his phone. It was from an unfamiliar number. He clicked it open, expecting another congratulatory note. But instead, it was a short message. "I know what you did, and I know what you owe." Arthur frowned. It was cryptic, unsettling. Who could this be? A journalist, maybe? Someone looking to exploit his donation for a story? He hit reply and typed, "Who is this?" but received no response. The words on the screen sent a chill down his spine. He was used to being in control, to making decisions that others followed. But this felt different. He could almost feel the invisible thread of his past pulling him backward, a reminder that no amount of money could erase the mistakes he had made. Arthur stood up, his chair scraping against the polished floor. He needed to get away. He needed answers. Something told him this was just the beginning of a journey that would reveal truths he wasn't ready to face. As he walked toward the door, his assistant called after him. "Mr. Montgomery, there's a call from the mayor's office. They're requesting a meeting regarding your recent donation." Arthur paused, his hand on the door handle. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like going forward. He turned to Rachel and said, "Tell them I'm unavailable." Then, without another word, he stepped out into the hallway, his mind racing. Arthur didn't know why he walked or where he was going, but the rhythmic pounding of his shoes against the pavement offered him a momentary distraction from the growing unease gnawing at his insides. His mind was a whirlwind of questions about the message, about Laura's words, about his own motivations. Everything seemed to blur together, until all that remained was the feeling of needing to do something, but not knowing what. He found himself outside his building, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. The city felt quieter than usual, as though it too was waiting for something to happen. A car honked as it sped by, but Arthur didn't flinch. He had been running on autopilot for too long. Everything had been scripted: his success, his generosity, his public persona. But now, something was unraveling. Something was slipping out of his grasp. His phone buzzed again, the unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. This time, he answered it immediately, a tinge of urgency creeping into his voice. "Who is this?" he asked, trying to keep his tone steady. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, almost too calm. "Arthur Montgomery. I think you know who I am?" A chill ran through him. He knew that voice. It wasn't from any of the usual business calls or charity leaders he'd spoken to. This was different. This was personal. "I don't know who you are, but I've had enough of these games," Arthur said, his grip tightening on the phone. "Stop playing around." The voice chuckled darkly. "You don't get it, do you, Arthur? You can give away all the money in the world, but it doesn't change what you've done. Not to me, not to your family, and certainly not to yourself." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. He felt the words cut into him, but he couldn't make sense of them. What had he done? Who was this person? And how did they know about his past? "I'm not who you think I am," Arthur muttered, the ground beneath him suddenly feeling unsteady. "I've changed. I'm trying to do good. You think a donation makes up for everything?" The voice laughed again, low and menacing. "You've been running from your past, Arthur. But you can't run forever." Arthur's breath quickened. He looked around, as if expecting to see someone watching him. His mind was racing, but it wasn't the busy, strategic thoughts of his business empire. It was a deep, unsettling fear. Fear that his past was about to catch up with him in ways he couldn't control. "You don't know anything about me," Arthur said, trying to regain his composure. "Oh, but I do," the voice replied. "And I'm coming for you. All you've done. Every penny you've donated, every good deed. It's not enough to erase what you owe." The line went dead. Arthur stood there, motionless, as the words echoed in his mind. What I owe? What did that mean? He had paid his dues, hadn't he? He had built his fortune with hard work, made his billions through sacrifice, and now he was giving it back to the world. Wasn't that what mattered? Wasn't that enough? He felt an overwhelming weight pressing down on him, a sensation so heavy that it almost felt physical. For the first time in a long while, Arthur realized that no amount of money or success could shield him from the things he had done in his past. The past that he had long buried, hoping it would stay hidden. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Montgomery?" Arthur turned sharply, finding himself face to face with a familiar figure. David, his former assistant from years ago. The man was older now, his hair thinning, but his eyes still carried the same intense focus. "What are you doing here?" Arthur asked, his voice a little too harsh. David didn't flinch. "I need to talk to you. About something important. Something you can't ignore." Arthur's stomach twisted. He had a sinking feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be good. David took a cautious step forward, his eyes darting around the street. "It's about the donation. I don't think you know the whole story behind it." Arthur's chest tightened. The words sounded innocuous, but they held an ominous undertone. "What are you talking about?" David hesitated before speaking. "You don't understand what this is connected to, Arthur. There are people who expect something in return. Big things. And they've been waiting for a long time. They won't be satisfied with your money alone." Arthur felt his blood run cold. His hand gripped the strap of his briefcase tightly, knuckles white. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. David leaned in closer, his voice almost a growl. "They're coming for you. And when they do, you won't be able to hide behind your billions." Arthur's heart raced. For the first time, he felt truly afraid. Afraid of the things that he couldn't control, afraid of the consequences of his past actions. As David turned to leave, he left Arthur with one final chilling sentence. "You're not as untouchable as you think." Arthur stood there, frozen in the gathering dusk, as the weight of the revelation crashed over him. His life, everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was on the brink of unraveling. Arthur stood motionless in the darkening street, the words from David echoing in his mind. "You're not as untouchable as you think." He couldn't shake the feeling that the walls he had spent years building around himself were crumbling, piece by piece. He turned, walking slowly back to his office, as the city around him seemed to move in slow motion, its usual chaos muted by the heaviness in his chest. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from something far deeper: guilt, shame, perhaps even regret. He couldn't place it, but it gnawed at him like an insidious ache. The weight of his past was never far behind. It had always been there, lurking in the corners of his mind, just beneath the surface. The lies he had told, the people he had betrayed, the choices he had made in the pursuit of power and wealth. Each one a shadow that had followed him for years. And now it was finally catching up with him. When he entered his office, he barely acknowledged the staff who were still there, working late into the evening. They greeted him with the usual politeness, but Arthur was lost in thought, barely hearing their voices as he walked past them. He could feel the cold air of the office pressing in, the sterile, impersonal space that had once given him comfort now feeling suffocating. He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop, but the screen was a blur. The financial reports, the numbers, the endless meetings, they were all distractions. Nothing mattered anymore. The donation, the headlines, the praise, it was all part of a performance, a way to make himself feel like he was doing the right thing. But deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. He stared at the screen, his reflection staring back at him, and for the first time, he didn't recognize the man in the glass. The sharp suit, the perfectly combed hair, the cold, calculating eyes, they were just a mask that had protected him from the truth for far too long. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," Arthur said, his voice hoarse. The door opened, and Rachel stepped inside. Her face was unreadable, but there was something different about her. Her usual professionalism seemed to be replaced with something else. Concern, maybe, or maybe it was just pity. "Mr. Montgomery," she said softly, walking toward his desk. "I've been going over some things. There's a situation we need to address. It's about the donation." Arthur's chest tightened. He could already feel the weight of what was coming. "Go ahead," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Rachel hesitated before speaking, glancing at the screen in front of him. "There's a group, people from your past. They've made it clear they expect something in return for the money you gave." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a punch to the gut, each one landing harder than the last. "You mean?" he began, but Rachel nodded, confirming his worst fears. "They're not interested in the charity work, Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice cold. "They want more from you, and they're not going to stop until they get it." Arthur stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He felt as though the room was spinning around him. "What do you mean more?" he asked, his voice rising. "I've already given them everything. I've given millions. What else do they want from me?" Rachel didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, as if trying to gather the right words. "They want control, Mr. Montgomery. They want leverage, and they'll stop at nothing to get it." Arthur ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "Who are these people? What do they want from me?" Rachel took a deep breath. "They were part of the deal, Arthur. The one you made all those years ago, when you were just starting out. You didn't just climb to the top on your own. There were favors, promises, and now they want what they're owed." Arthur felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had made deals in his youth, deals that were shady, desperate, and perhaps even immoral. But he had thought they were behind him. He had thought he was free of that life, that he could move forward and be the man he wanted to be. But now, the past was coming back, and it was dragging him down. "How do you know about all this?" he asked, his voice breaking the tense silence. Rachel looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and concern. "I know more than you think. I've been doing some digging. You're not the only one who's been keeping secrets, Arthur." The words hit him like a slap in the face. He had always thought he was in control, that he could manipulate the narrative, but now he was the one being played. "I need to fix this," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to make it right." Rachel nodded, but there was a shadow in her eyes. "I don't think it's that simple anymore." Arthur's world had been built on money, power, and control. But now it felt like all of it was slipping through his fingers, and no matter how much he gave, no matter how much he tried to make things right, it might never be enough. Arthur sat back down at his desk, his hands clenched into fists. The revelation that his past deals were catching up to him was more than he could process. Each piece of the puzzle, a puzzle he thought was long solved, was now showing him a different, darker picture. Who are these people, Rachel? His voice was low, strained but desperate. He needed answers, needed control. Who do they think they are, coming after me like this? Rachel remained standing, her posture stiff. She wasn't scared, but she was cautious. They're not just anyone, Mr. Montgomery. These are the people who helped you rise to the top. They helped build your empire. They were the ones who funded the initial projects when you were just starting out. They expected repayment, not in money, but in loyalty. Arthur's stomach twisted. He hadn't realized how much he had relied on them, how deeply entwined their promises were in the foundation of his success. He had been so focused on the empire he was building, the brand he was crafting, that he'd ignored the strings attached to his ascent. Now, those strings were pulling him back, tightening with every passing second. His thoughts raced. So all this, the donations, the media attention, it was never enough, was it? No matter how much I gave back, they always expected more. Rachel shook her head slowly, her eyes darkening. More than just money, Arthur. They want control. They want you to do what they want, when they want. They want to be able to pull the strings, to manipulate you into actions that benefit them. Arthur gripped the edge of his desk, the weight of her words crushing him. The generosity, the donations, it had been a mask, a way to ease his conscience, to feel like he could balance the scales after years of corporate greed. But it was never enough. I can't let them destroy everything I've worked for. His voice cracked with the weight of the thought. I've worked too hard for this, Rachel. I can't let it all fall apart. Rachel's eyes softened for a brief moment, but her voice remained firm. You're already in too deep, Arthur. They've been waiting for you to slip. They've been patient. And now, they're going to collect. Arthur stood up abruptly, pacing across the room. His mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He was a man accustomed to finding solutions, to negotiating his way out of tight spots, to turning the odds in his favor. But this wasn't a deal. This wasn't something he could smooth over with a check or a clever legal maneuver. This was a reckoning, and no amount of money or charm would stop it. I can't just stand here and let them ruin everything, he muttered to himself. There has to be a way to fix this. Rachel stepped closer, her voice quiet but insistent. Arthur, sometimes there are things you can't fix. Sometimes the cost of what you've built is too high. You've spent so many years building an empire, but you didn't see the price. And now it's time to pay. The words stung like a slap, but Arthur couldn't deny the truth behind them. He had always believed that his wealth could shield him, that it could buy him anything: protection, influence, redemption. But now, standing at the edge of his empire, he realized that nothing could protect him from the consequences of his past choices. Is that it then? Arthur asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Am I just supposed to accept it? Let them tear everything down? Rachel looked at him, her expression unreadable. I'm not saying you have to accept it, Arthur, but you have to understand, there are consequences. There are always consequences. Arthur's mind reeled. How did it all come to this? How had he allowed himself to be so blind to the people who had truly been pulling the strings? He had always told himself that his success was a result of hard work, of his brilliance. But now, with the weight of everything crashing down around him, he saw that it wasn't just hard work. It was manipulation, it was promises made in the dark, and it was debts that were never meant to be forgotten. He looked up at Rachel, the weight of everything pressing down on him. How do we fight this? Rachel didn't immediately answer. Instead, she studied him, her eyes searching for something. You can't fight it, Arthur. Not the way you're thinking. This is bigger than you, bigger than money. This is about who you are and who they want you to be. Arthur took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The floor beneath him felt unstable, as if everything he had ever built, his wealth, his image, his empire, was crumbling before his eyes. But beneath the fear, beneath the panic, something stirred. A spark, a sense of defiance. I won't let them win, he said, his voice gaining strength. I will fix this. I'll find a way. Rachel didn't respond. She merely nodded, her expression unreadable. As Arthur walked toward the window of his office, the city skyline stretched before him, bathed in the harsh glow of artificial light. The world outside seemed so distant now, so out of reach, but he couldn't afford to back down. He had fought too hard for this life, and he wasn't about to let it be taken from him so easily. With a steely resolve, Arthur made up his mind. He would face his past. He would confront those who were pulling the strings. And whatever it took, he would fight for his future. The days blurred together as Arthur dove into damage control. He couldn't shake the suffocating pressure, the constant nagging realization that he was no longer the architect of his own fate. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life. Yet now, it felt as though the very walls he had built were closing in on him, brick by brick, as if the past were coming to swallow him whole. Arthur spent hours locked in meetings, his mind elsewhere. His sharp instincts, once his greatest asset, now seemed dull and unreliable. Every conversation, every decision felt like a mere formality. His attention was consumed by the looming threat of the people from his past, the ones who had helped him rise and now demanded their due. The city outside his office window felt like a foreign world, distant and disconnected. The bright lights of the skyline, the hustle and bustle of the streets below, none of it mattered anymore. All of his wealth, all of his power, felt meaningless in the face of what was coming for him. He couldn't buy his way out of this. There was no check large enough, no contract tight enough to protect him from what he had ignored for so long. It wasn't until Rachel called him late one night that he realized just how deep the hole had become. "Arthur," her voice came through the phone, strained but urgent. "We need to talk. It's worse than we thought." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "They've reached out," she continued, her tone low, almost fearful. "They've made their demands, and they're not playing games anymore. They want you to sign over part of your company. They want control of the board. If you don't comply, they'll go public with everything. Your past, your mistakes, the deals you thought were buried." The words hit him like a physical blow. The air in the room seemed to leave him in a rush, as if the weight of his past sins had finally caught up to him. He leaned against the desk, pressing his palm to his forehead, trying to make sense of it all. "I can't do that, Rachel. I can't give them what they want." "I know," Rachel replied softly, "but I think we've reached the point where we don't have a choice." Arthur clenched his jaw, his eyes scanning the room as if he could somehow find a solution within the sterile walls of his office. But no matter where he looked, there was no way out, no magic fix. He had built his empire on the backs of deals that had bound him to the people who now sought to destroy him. He had been blind to the cost, to the price he would eventually pay. And now, there was no escaping it. "Do they know everything?" Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Do they know about my family?" Rachel hesitated. "I'm not sure, but they've been digging. And they're not stopping until they get what they want." Arthur's heart sank. His family, the one thing he had promised himself to protect at all costs, was at risk now too. His daughter, his wife, everything he had tried to shield from the consequences of his past. They were all on the line. "Give me everything you can on them," he said, his voice firm despite the tremble in his hands. "I want to know everything about these people, every move they've made. I'm not going down without a fight." Rachel paused, then spoke with a hint of caution. "Arthur, I don't know if there's a way out of this. Not without giving up something. Not without making a choice that will change everything." "I don't care," Arthur snapped, his patience wearing thin. "Do your job, Rachel. Give me the information. I'll find a way to fix this." After a long silence, Rachel gave a quiet "yes, sir," and the call ended. Arthur sat in the silence of his office, the weight of her words pressing on his chest. He was trapped. He couldn't run from his past anymore. He had spent years building this life, this image of success, only to realize that it was fragile, a house of cards built on promises he'd broken, lies he'd told, and debts that could never be repaid. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," Arthur called, his voice hoarse. The door opened slowly, and Michael, his trusted assistant, stepped inside. Michael's expression was grim, his usual confident demeanor replaced with a hint of concern. "Sir, there's someone here to see you," Michael said. He says it's urgent. Arthur's mind raced. He didn't have the energy for more visitors, not with everything else going on. But there was something in Michael's tone that made him pause. Who is it? Michael hesitated. It's David. From your past. Arthur's heart stopped. David. The one person who knew everything. The one person who could destroy him with a single word. Send him in, Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. The door opened wider, and David stepped inside. The years had not been kind to him. His hair was graying at the temples, his once youthful face now marked with the lines of age and regret. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were the same. The man who had once been a friend, a mentor, and a business partner now felt like a stranger, a reminder of everything Arthur had tried to forget. David's gaze locked onto Arthur's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the air between them had thickened, heavy with history, with all the deals, all the betrayals they had shared over the years. Finally, David broke the silence. Arthur, it's time. You know what you have to do. Arthur felt his chest tighten. I'm not going to give in to you, David. David smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You don't have a choice. Arthur stood motionless, facing David. The man who had once been a mentor, a partner in his rise to the top, was now the one threatening to tear it all down. The tension between them was palpable, as if the years of shared history had forged an invisible chain binding them together. David's presence filled the room, an unspoken reminder of everything Arthur had done to get here. The deals that had seemed so far in the past now resurfaced like ghosts, clawing at the edges of his mind. He had always prided himself on controlling his future, but standing here in front of David, he realized just how little control he truly had. You've gone too far, Arthur, David said, his voice cold but calculating. The people who helped you get here, they're not fools. They know what you've been hiding, what you've tried to bury. And now, they're done waiting for you to come around. They want what's owed to them. Arthur felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly replaced by a deep, gnawing fear. His empire, the thing he had sacrificed everything for, was slipping through his fingers. The fear of losing it all was suffocating. He had been in control for so long, and now, standing before the man who knew him better than anyone, he was nothing more than a shell of the man he once was. I don't owe you anything, David, Arthur said, his voice tight. I built this empire with my own hands. I didn't need you or anyone else. I don't need you now. David chuckled darkly. You think that's how it works, Arthur? You think you built this all by yourself? No one builds an empire alone. Not even you. You had help. And now, it's time to pay the piper. Arthur's mind raced, the weight of David's words pressing down on him like a vice. He had always known that his success had come with strings attached, but he had never fully understood the cost. Now, it was too late to go back. The walls were closing in. You're in over your head, Arthur, David continued, his voice almost sympathetic. There's nothing you can do to stop this. Nothing you can do to fix it. The only question left is whether you're going to lose everything on your terms or on theirs. Arthur's heart raced. His hands trembled, but he clenched them into fists, refusing to let David see any weakness. He had fought for everything he had. He wasn't going to let it all slip away now. I'm not going to give you what you want, Arthur said, his voice low but firm. I'll fight you until the very end. David's eyes darkened, his smile vanishing. You don't understand, do you? There's no fight left, Arthur. You've already lost. You're just too stubborn to see it. Arthur's pulse quickened. He could feel the walls of his empire crumbling, the foundation of his life starting to crack under the weight of his own choices. Everything he had built, the wealth, the influence, the image, was a house of cards. One wrong move, and it would all come crashing down. David stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You'll give them what they want, Arthur, or everything you've ever worked for will be destroyed. Your reputation, your company, your family. I don't think you want to find out how far they're willing to go to get what they deserve. Arthur's mind raced. He had always thought he could control the narrative. But now, with David in front of him and the looming threat of the people from his past closing in, he realized he had no control left. I won't let them ruin my family, Arthur said, his voice low but filled with determination. David's lips curled into a twisted grin. You think they care about your family? You think they'll hesitate to destroy them if it gets them what they want? You're a fool, Arthur. You've always been a fool. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. Arthur's vision blurred, his heart pounding in his chest. He was trapped. There was no escape. The people from his past were coming for him, and the empire he had spent so many years building was on the verge of collapse. But then, a thought struck him, an idea that for the first time in weeks gave him a glimmer of hope. He may have been trapped, but he wasn't powerless. There had to be a way to turn this around. There had to be something he could do to fight back. Arthur straightened, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. I won't give them control. I won't let them win. I'll find a way to turn this around. David's expression faltered for the briefest moment. You're delusional, Arthur. It's over. But Arthur's resolve was ironclad now. He had nothing left to lose. He wasn't going to give up his empire, his family, or his future without a fight. The stakes had never been higher, but he was prepared to do whatever it took. David saw the fire in Arthur's eyes, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. Arthur had always been a man who played by the rules, but now he realized that the rules had changed. He wasn't going to follow the script anymore. It was time to rewrite the narrative. I'll give them something they never expected, Arthur said, his voice unwavering. I'll give them a fight they won't forget. David took a step back, his smirk fading into a look of genuine concern. You can't fight this, Arthur. You're already too deep in it. Arthur didn't reply. Instead, he turned toward the window, the city skyline stretching out before him like a distant dream. He had always believed that his success was inevitable, that nothing could take it away from him. But now, he understood that success came at a price. And if he was going to keep everything he had worked for, he was going to have to pay it. The fight wasn't over yet, and Arthur wasn't ready to give up, not just yet. The next morning, Arthur woke with a heavy sense of dread settling over him like a suffocating blanket. The events of the night before replayed in his mind, David's warning echoing in his thoughts. You've already lost. He had always prided himself on his ability to solve any problem, face any challenge head-on. But now, faced with the weight of his own past, he felt powerless, as if all the power he had accumulated over the years had been nothing more than an illusion. He stood by the window, staring at the city below. The world outside was busy, oblivious to the storm brewing in his life. It was a cruel contrast, life going on while his was crumbling. His empire was built on deals that tied him to people he had hoped would never come calling again. But now they were demanding their pound of flesh. Rachel had called again that morning. She was working on finding out more about David's associates, the people who were pulling the strings behind the scenes. But even with all of her resources, Arthur knew that time was running out. He was playing a game of catch-up, and the people who wanted to destroy him were always one step ahead. Arthur's mind raced as he sifted through the choices before him. He could give in, sign over the company, and maintain his wealth, but it would mean losing control, losing everything he had built. The thought of surrender made his stomach turn. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. But if he fought, if he refused to comply with their demands, the consequences would be dire. It wasn't just his company at risk anymore. His family, his reputation, everything was hanging in the balance. He walked over to his desk and grabbed the letter he had received from David's associates the night before. It was a final ultimatum, one that Arthur knew he couldn't ignore. The letter had no room for negotiation. If he didn't comply by the end of the week, they would expose his past, drag his name through the mud, and make sure his company was destroyed. It was a threat, plain and simple. Arthur's mind flashed to his family. He thought of his wife, Vanessa, the woman who had stood by him through everything, the one person who had never asked for more than he could give. And then there was Olivia, his daughter. He couldn't lose her. He wouldn't lose her. The thought of what his actions might do to them, the damage it could cause, the pain they might endure, was unbearable. He had spent years protecting them from the consequences of his choices. But now, it seemed that everything was about to come crashing down. He had lived a life of success and wealth. But at what cost? The sacrifices he had made, the people he had stepped on to climb to the top, all of it was coming back to haunt him. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," Arthur called, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel entered, her face drawn with exhaustion. She had been working tirelessly to find a way out, but the strain was starting to show. Arthur could see it in her eyes. She was beginning to doubt that there was any escape from the mess they were in. "We've got a problem," she said, her tone serious. "They're pushing harder than we thought. We've traced some of the people behind David, and it's worse than we imagined. These aren't just business rivals, Arthur. These people are dangerous. They've got connections, power we can't touch." Arthur closed his eyes, feeling a wave of despair wash over him. The walls were closing in faster than he had anticipated. There was no way out. He had played this game for years, thinking he could control the outcome, but now it felt as if he were trapped in a nightmare of his own making. "We need to do something, Arthur," Rachel pressed, her voice urgent. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to destroy everything. We have to fight back." Arthur turned to her, his mind racing. How? How can we fight back when we don't even know who we're really up against?" Rachel hesitated, looking down at her feet for a moment before meeting his gaze again. "I've been thinking, there might be a way to turn the tables. If we can expose their weaknesses, we could have a chance. But it's risky." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of risk?" Rachel's eyes hardened, and she took a step closer. "We go public. We leak what we know about their operations, their connections. We hit them where it hurts, but it means playing dirty. And once we do that, there's no turning back." Arthur clenched his jaw, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had always tried to play by the rules, to keep his hands clean, but now he was faced with a choice: fight dirty or lose everything. The stakes had never been higher. He thought of Vanessa, of Olivia. What kind of man would he be if he let them down? What kind of father would he be if he let his empire and everything he had fought for crumble in front of their eyes? He had no choice. He would do whatever it took to protect them, to protect everything he had worked for. "Do it," Arthur said, his voice low but resolute. "Expose them. Let the world know who they really are." Rachel nodded, her expression hardening. "Are you sure? This is the point of no return, Arthur." Arthur swallowed hard. "I'm sure." As Rachel left the room to begin gathering the evidence, Arthur sat back in his chair, staring at the letter on his desk. The one that had come from David's associates. The ultimatum. He had made his choice. There was no turning back now. The next few days passed in a blur of frantic meetings, hurried phone calls, and sleepless nights. Arthur barely slept, his mind consumed by the weight of the decision he had made. The world outside his office seemed distant, like a separate reality. All that mattered now was the battle he had chosen to fight, a battle that would either save him or destroy him. Rachel had been working tirelessly, digging into every possible lead, piecing together the hidden web of connections that stretched far beyond David's reach. Every time Arthur spoke with her, the intensity in her voice grew, the urgency clear. They were getting closer, but so was David's deadline. Every moment that passed felt like a countdown to an inevitable disaster. Arthur had always been a man of control, able to steer the course of his own life with a sharp focus and unyielding resolve. But now control was an illusion. The past he had buried, the mistakes he had tried to outrun, were rising to the surface faster than he could manage. His every move felt like it was being watched, his every decision scrutinized. Vanessa could see the toll it was taking on him. She had stopped asking about the late nights, the unanswered calls, the tension that had begun to seep into their home. She knew something was wrong, but Arthur couldn't bring himself to tell her. She didn't deserve to carry the weight of this with him. Late one evening, after another exhausting meeting with Rachel, Arthur returned home to find Vanessa sitting at the kitchen table. She was holding a cup of tea, her hands trembling slightly as she took a sip. The dim light of the kitchen seemed to reflect the strain in her eyes. "Arthur," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence in the room. "I know something's wrong. You haven't been the same lately." Arthur stopped in the doorway, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him. He could feel her gaze, the silent plea in her eyes, and for the first time in days, he felt the need to explain, to tell her everything. But how could he drag her into the mess he had created? He took a deep breath and stepped closer, sitting down across from her. "Vanessa, there's something you need to understand." She placed her cup on the table, her hands now folded in front of her, her eyes fixed on him. I already know. It's David, isn't it? And all the people behind him. You've been hiding something from me, Arthur. I can see it. I can feel it. Arthur felt a tightness in his chest, the guilt gnawing at him. Vanessa had always been the steady anchor in his life. She had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. And now, he was about to tear everything apart with his choices. I've made some choices that I regret, Arthur said, his voice heavy with the weight of his admission. Choices that put us all in danger. But I'm going to fix it. I swear to you I will. Vanessa reached across the table, her hand gently resting on his. Arthur, what have you done? What are you doing? He looked down, his gaze falling on their hands. He could feel the trembling in her touch. She was scared. She should be. I'm fighting, Vanessa, he said, his voice raw. I'm fighting to protect everything we have, but I have to make some difficult decisions. People are trying to take everything from me, everything I've worked for, and if I don't act now, I'll lose it all. Vanessa's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. Arthur, whatever it is, we can face it together. We've faced everything together. Arthur's heart broke at her words. She had always been his rock, his constant, but now he was pulling her into the storm he had created, and he wasn't sure if they would survive it. I'm not asking you to be part of this, he said, his voice low. This is my fight, but I won't lose you. Not for anything. Vanessa stood up, her expression resolute. Arthur, you don't have to protect me from the truth. I can handle it. We can handle it. Together. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He knew she was right. She had always been strong, always been there for him, no matter what. But this time, he didn't know if he could carry the weight of it all. The decision to go public, to expose everything, it would change their lives forever. And he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to deal with the fallout. I'll do whatever it takes, Arthur whispered, almost to himself. I'll fight until the end. Vanessa nodded, her eyes unwavering. Then we fight together. No matter what happens, we'll face it. Together. Arthur looked at her, the woman who had stood by him through every mistake, every triumph, every failure. And for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't just about saving his empire anymore. It wasn't about his success or wealth. It was about protecting the people he loved, about protecting her, about protecting Olivia. The phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the moment like a knife. Arthur stood up quickly, his heart racing. It was Rachel. He knew what it meant. Arthur. Rachel's voice came through, shaky but urgent. They're making their move. We need to act now. Arthur glanced at Vanessa, who gave him a reassuring nod. He had no more time to waste. It was time to face the consequences of his choices. As he hung up the phone, he realized that this battle was far from over, and it would cost him more than he had ever imagined. But with Vanessa by his side, maybe, just maybe, he could turn the tide. Arthur stood in the boardroom, surrounded by faces he had once considered allies. Now, they were nothing more than strangers, each one holding their own secrets, their own ambitions. His heart beat erratically as he looked across the polished surface of the table, feeling the weight of their collective judgment pressing in from all sides. David's people had made their move, just as Rachel had predicted. The media had been alerted. The story was already being shared across social platforms, and soon it would be splashed across every headline. The once respected billionaire Arthur Jennings, exposed for his shady dealings, his unethical choices, his past that he had tried so hard to bury. The room was silent, every eye on him, waiting for the inevitable. He could feel the cold sweat on the back of his neck. He had prepared for this moment in countless scenarios in his head, but nothing could have prepared him for the crushing sense of inevitability that now hung in the air. He could hear Vanessa's voice in his mind, telling him that they would face it together. And yet, even as he felt her presence in his heart, the loneliness of the moment was suffocating. This wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about his empire or his success. It was about something deeper, something he had neglected for far too long. The doors opened, and Rachel stepped inside. Her face was set, determined, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. She walked toward him, placing a stack of documents on the table. She had done her part. Now, it was his turn to act. Arthur, Rachel said, her voice steady but urgent. They're not going to stop. You have to go public. The longer you wait, the worse it gets. He nodded slowly, the decision already made. He had no choice. This was the price of his decisions, the price of his ambition, the price of his silence. Turning to the board members, Arthur took a deep breath, the words suddenly feeling heavier than they ever had before. I've made mistakes, he began, his voice shaking only slightly. I've built an empire, but it's not built on a foundation of truth. It's built on compromises, on choices that I thought I could outrun. But now, the consequences have caught up with me. I can't run anymore. He paused, letting the weight of his admission settle in. This wasn't just a confession. It was the reckoning he had been dreading for years. The walls he had built to protect himself were coming down, brick by brick, and all he could do now was face it. I've spent my life accumulating power, wealth, and control. But at what cost? His voice cracked, the vulnerability in his words catching him off guard. I've hurt people. I've lied. And now I have to face that. All of it. The room was quiet. For the first time, Arthur could see the people around him not as rivals or enemies, but as witnesses to his failure. The truth had come crashing down around him, and there was no escaping it now. Arthur, what are you saying? One of the board members asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Are you admitting to everything? Arthur nodded, feeling the sting of shame in his chest. Yes, I am, and I'm not running anymore. I'll face whatever comes next. No more lies. No more secrets. Rachel watched him closely, her gaze sharp, but there was a hint of something else in her eyes. Relief, perhaps, or even a trace of pride. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. As the room erupted into murmurs, Arthur stood tall, his gaze fixed on the man who had once been his greatest rival. David. It was time to bring everything into the light. There would be no more running, no more hiding. Arthur stepped forward, taking the stack of documents Rachel had placed on the table. These were the details, the evidence that would expose everything, the hidden deals, the illicit contacts, the people he had manipulated. He slid the documents across the table, his eyes locking onto each of the board members. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Arthur said quietly, his voice steady. I'm not asking for anything. I'm simply telling you the truth. What you do with it is up to you. He turned away from the table, his back straight, his mind racing with a million thoughts. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. But for the first time in years, it felt like he had finally done something right. He had exposed the truth, not just to the world, but to himself. As he stepped out of the boardroom, the cold air of the hallway hit him like a wave. He had expected to feel empty, to feel the crushing weight of his failure. But instead, there was a strange sense of clarity, like he had lifted a burden he had carried for far too long. Rachel followed him, her footsteps quiet but purposeful. You did the right thing, she said softly. Arthur glanced at her, a faint smile crossing his face. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of acknowledgement. The battle wasn't over. He still had a long way to go. But for the first time, he knew who he was. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. As he walked down the hall, his phone buzzed. It was Vanessa. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. He answered quickly, his voice low. Vanessa, I'm proud of you, she said, cutting him off. I know this hasn't been easy, but you did the right thing. We're in this together. Always. Arthur stood still for a moment, the weight of her words washing over him. He had feared losing her, but now, with her by his side, he knew that he had already won the most important battle of all. In a world where success is often built on secrets and compromises, Arthur's journey reminds us that true freedom comes only when we face our own truths. No matter how high we climb, the cost of hiding who we are is always too great. His story shows that redemption is not about perfection, but about owning our mistakes and finding the courage to change. If this story resonated with you, don't let it end here. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Arthur's shoes? Hit the like button if you believe in second chances, and share this video with those who need a reminder that the truth always has its moment. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. Don't miss the next powerful story, because you never know when the next revelation will change everything.